Let's start talking about engines, because engines are what rockets use to get us from the ground into space, and in space, they help us move from place to place. But in order to understand rocket engines, let's first talk about jet engines, because jet engines are something that we're really more familiar with because, we see jet engines fairly often. We see airplanes flying through the sky all the time. So in a rocket engine, we know that a rocket engine has to operate in space. And so a rocket engine has to carry both the fuel and the oxidizer with it, and those have to be combined to basically make the rocket go. In a jet engine, the oxygen comes from the air that it's flying through, right? So we basically use fuel on board the jet, but we use oxygen coming from the air. So how do we move something forward using a jet engine? Well, the engine turns fan blades, and these fan blades accelerate the air. So it brings in air and then accelerates the air out the back. And it uses Newton's third law. So it brings in air and then it shoves it out the back at a much faster speed. And so then it's propelled forward. It uses the conservation of momentum to accelerate the air out the back and then push itself forward. The first form of a jet engine was actually the propeller. The propeller basically uses the same concept. It brings air in, slower moving air, and it accelerates that air and it pushes it out the back. So air comes in, it gets accelerated by the propeller, and it pushes air out. It uses oxygen from the atmosphere, mixes that with fuel, and makes the engine go. So that's the simplest form of a jet engine, if you will. Propellers are used in all sorts of airplanes, but all of these airplanes are pretty slow airplanes because the propeller must spin basically faster than the air. And so it's got to accelerate that air. And so as you go faster and faster, the propellers become less efficient. But if we want to go faster, we need something more. So we basically brought in the jet engine. The jet engine has 5 stages to generate thrust. The first is that air comes in on the left side, and there are fan blades that sort of act like propellers, and they bring that air in and they compress that air. That air goes into a combustion chamber where it's mixed with fuel. That fuel and oxygen get mixed up, it burns, and then it is exhausted out the back. That exhausted air actually passes through some fan blades that you see on the right-hand side. And interestingly, as the air passes through those fan blades, it's making those fan blades turn, right? So those fan blades aren't accelerating the air anymore. That combusted air is actually turning those fan blades. Those fan blades turn that shaft, which actually turns the fans on the left side in that air intake, right? So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. The air comes in, you get combustion, the air flows out, which turns fan blades, which brings the air in. That hot air gets exhausted at a much higher speed than the intake speed, and it causes the airplane to move forward. So you basically have this cold section where you have air coming in, and then you have this hot section where you have combustion and air flowing out. That air flowing out turns a turbine. That turbine causes the intake fans to bring more air in. So instead of the shaft turning the turbine, which turns the air intake fans, you could have that shaft turning all sorts of stuff, which is really interesting. This turbo shaft jet engine turns the shaft for the rotors for the helicopter to fly. Then we have these things called turboprops, which are exactly the same thing, except that it's actually turning a propeller instead of turning a rotor for a helicopter. It's turning the propeller. And then you have what's called a turbofan engine, which is the most common type of jet engine. And that basically has a big fan at the front, and then you have this region where the gas basically is contained. And that region where the gas is contained is part of the jet engine. Okay, so let's talk about the turbofan a little bit more. Cold air and combusted air get combined on the exit of that. And the amount of cold air versus combusted air makes what's called this bypass ratio. And that's the ratio of the cold air that's passing around the outside versus the amount of combusted air which is going through the jet engine. So we have what's called a high bypass turbofan and a low bypass turbofan, and there are uses for both. In the high bypass turbofan, you have subsonic flight. They're much more efficient. You have greater thrust that you can achieve using the high bypass turbofan engine. And they're quieter because they have this buffer region where there's a lot of air between the combustion that's happening, which is the loud bit, and the outside world. The high bypass is used most exclusively for commercial airplanes. In the low bypass, it's used for supersonic flight. You can have an afterburner with it. They're much more compact because instead of having this large area where cooler air can go, you have like this really compact design because there's not very much that goes around the combustion chamber. And they're much noisier because you don't have this area of air to be between you and the combustion chamber. And that is mostly used in military aircraft. An example of a high bypass turbofan is the GE 90-94B on a Boeing 777. Probably you have seen a jet engine, a commercial jet engine, which looks a lot like this. And they have a lot of the air going around the combustion chamber. An example of a low bypass turbofan is the Pratt & Whitney F119 with an afterburner, and we probably have not seen this one very often. Then, if you go to higher velocity airplanes, we have what's called a ramjet. A ramjet engine now has no moving parts to it. The combustion, the compression, all of that actually happens with just geometry. As the thing is moving through the air, air is coming in, it's being compressed. We combust it, and then it goes out using the geometry of what's called a de-Laval nozzle. And so just using that geometry, we can actually get this jet engine with no moving parts, which is really cool. It basically requires that we're going at supersonic speeds. The diffuser, so basically that's the thing at the very front, brings the air in, it compresses it, and it slows it down to subsonic speeds. Then the compression occurs. It happens because of the geometry and not because of blades. You can't start this thing because you have to have air moving. This thing actually won't operate from a dead stop because you have to have air moving in. So basically you have to be moving at supersonic speeds in order to actually even use this. And so they're used in supersonic guided missiles. So if you're on a military jet and you're wanting to shoot a supersonic missile, you may have a ramjet on your supersonic guided missile. So another supersonic air intake system is what's called the scramjet, which is amazingly like the ramjet, but it is supersonic combustion ramjet. So the ramjet air doesn't slow down to subsonic speeds. The compression actually happens at supersonic speeds. And so it's called the SC ramjet or supersonic combustion ramjet or scramjet engine. It's a much simpler design than the ramjet engine, but it is actually much harder to get right. It has much more complex aerodynamics, and it is highly experimental. We talked at one point in a previous lesson about the X-15 experimental aircraft. There was another experimental aircraft called the X-51 Wave Rider, which used this. Let's talk about specific impulse, because specific impulse lets you judge sort of the efficiency of an airplane or a jet engine. So this is how much thrust is generated when a given amount of fuel mass is used. So it describes the change in momentum per unit of propellant used, but it basically describes the efficiency of the engine. And that's sort of how we're going to use it. And because the units are a little bit confusing, what we're going to do is talk about it as sort of an effective exhaust velocity. So if you take specific impulse, you multiply it by gravity, you get this effective exhaust velocity. So you can multiply the effective exhaust velocity times the mass flow rate, and that gives you the thrust of the engine. So that's why I like to use this effective exhaust velocity, because we can directly relate that to the thrust of the engine. Just like exhaust velocity numbers, higher is better, right? Because a higher exhaust velocity gives you a larger thrust for the same mass flow rate. High numbers are good for specific impulse. Jet engines actually have a very high specific impulse. And the reason for that is because they don't have to carry their own oxidizer. They bring in air from the surrounding atmosphere, which makes the engine, just as a start, at least 2 times as good as a rocket engine, because you're not carrying the oxidizer. So there's this chart which basically shows you the specific impulse or effective exhaust velocity as a function of the Mach number, or the speed at which you can move. Basically, way up high at very low Mach numbers, we have commercial airplanes. Commercial jets have very, very high specific impulses. And the reason that they have very high specific impulses is because they fly relatively slow and they fly at low altitudes. So they have lots of oxygen that they can breathe, and they're moving slow enough that they can get really good combustion. But as you go to faster speeds, you're getting up into your military airplanes, your military jet fighters. Now you're moving much faster, so it's harder to bring in that oxygen. You're flying at higher altitudes, so you have less oxygen to bring in. So your specific impulse is actually lower, but you're flying at faster speeds. So you can go much faster, but you're much less efficient. So you have lower efficiency, but you can go to higher speeds. A rocket engine, on the other hand, carries the oxidizer, so it can operate at any speed you want, but they have very low specific impulse. You can go as fast as you want with a rocket engine, but it is at a cost of being very, very low efficiency. So in summary, jet engines use air from the atmosphere. They're much more efficient than rocket engines, and rocket engines have to carry their oxidizer and all the exhausted mass. Specific impulse is a measure of the engine efficiency. So jet engines have a much higher specific impulse than rocket engines. And in general, faster airplanes, if you go faster, you have a worse specific impulse because it's harder to bring in that oxygen. It's hard to have combustion at these very fast speeds.